Okay, good evening, everyone, and happy Black History Month. I'm Emily from the U.S.Embassy Algiers, and you are watching Let's Chat, a show on American culture. I'm broadcasting to you live from the American Cultural Center Algiers. Yes, our ACCA, as we call it, is still closed to the public because of COVID, but you can practice your English, join clubs, and more at our other American Cultural Centers, which are located in Oran, Constantine, Wergela, and Bishar. So it's Black History Month, which is celebrated in America every February. We celebrate Black History Month to honor the contributions and sacrifices of African Americans who have helped shape the United States of America. All month, we'll be doing programs on this topic on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. So some might ask, why single out one group of people for an entire month? And really sorry about this, guys, but we have a drill. I'm here in the U.S. Embassy, and we have a drill going on us right now. I'm going to keep talking, and hopefully you can focus on my voice and not the drill. So why do we single out one group of people for a whole month? We do this because when we learn the history of a country, any country, we're often not taught about the contributions that minorities, be those women or people of color, have made. Black History Month is a time to learn about those contributions and focus on these marginalized people who may have been overlooked in history. So today, what we're going to talk about is some famous Black Americans, although perhaps some of these people will actually be new to you. We're going to hear about a boxer, I bet you know his name, a writer, a diplomat, and a journalist. So I've invited some diplomats from the U.S. Embassy Algiers, and I asked them each to share a story of an African American whose contributions made a significant impact to the U.S. So I'd love to welcome Amr. Hey, Amr.
Hey, Emily. Hey, everybody.
And we also have Lyntra. Hello, Lyntra.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for being here. And we also have Adam. Hey, Adam.
Hey, guys. How you doing?
So to our audience on YouTube, if you have questions for our diplomats about their presentation or about Black History Month, please ask those questions in the chat on YouTube, and we will ask our presenters your questions. So I'm going to start by introducing to you Amr. Amr Khan is the Financial Management Officer at the U.S. Embassy Algiers. He was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and he moved to the U.S. when he was young. He worked for many years in high-tech companies in Silicon Valley and in the Boston area. He has previously served as a U.S. diplomat in India, Turkey, and Ecuador. So Amr, who are you going to be telling us about?
Hi, everyone. Hey, Emily. So I'm going to talk about Muhammad Ali. He is a personality, a boxer, someone I have known forever. You know, he as a kid, I remember I used to wake up really early in the morning and watch one of his fights. And, you know, all these fights that were the famous ones that happened, some in Africa, Manila, all over the world. He was a worldwide superstar, as everybody knows. And I'm sure I can't imagine anybody on this chat here today who does not know Muhammad Ali. And if you don't, you know, maybe I'll introduce you to somebody you will cherish. So as I said, as a child, I used to wake up early in the morning, because the fights, or wherever the fights were in the world, they'd show them. I remember just waking up really early and watching his fights. And you know, he was this very loud, very, very charismatic American, and he was this. I related to America through Muhammad Ali in many ways. You know, he was this person who would be very loud, very, very vociferous, very opinionated, very strong. And I used to watch him, and all I knew him as was a boxer, right? The greatest boxer ever, but a boxer. And not until I came to the United States did I realize how he had contributed well beyond being a boxer. And today I want to talk about him. You know, we will discuss a little bit about his boxing, and you know, we will think about, you know, many things. But today I want to talk to him as somebody who you know, may have who have contributed beyond boxing, right? Beyond what I think a normal athlete would ever contribute as. And this is somebody who I think is very much one of the very influential people, not just in sport, but as an incredible personality who changed America. Fundamentally impacted America. So I have a few pictures of him, and this is him in Louisville. And let me start with a couple of things. One, he was born in Louisville. His parents, he was born in a poor family. His father was a billboard painter. He used to paint street signs, and his mom was a household helper. He grew up in the South, so in Kentucky, Louisville, and all his life he faced adversity because as a young person. But when I got to America, I got to know what he had done, and the most important thing that I think, he grew up during what's called the civil rights movement. I'm not sure how many of you know about civil rights. I hope that the civil rights movement is something you have heard about, but I'll just quickly give you an idea. But I'd like to know how many of you on the call today have actually heard about the civil rights movement in the United States. It was a political movement from 1954 to 1968. However, it had its roots in the 19th century, but it was led by Dr. Martin Luther King and many others. It was primarily a non-violent resistance movement and civil disobedience as a core mechanism, along with a sustained litigation against laws that deprived Black Americans of their civil rights. So for those of you, at the time, there were all these laws which are known as the Jim Crow laws, which basically prevented, if you were of color, to be able to participate in society as an equal member. So the civil rights movement was to restore the rights of Black Americans to do simple things like sit in a restaurant with as an equal, sit in a bus and drink from a water fountain which was in the street. There are all these basic things, and at the extreme level, you could imagine that there were people getting lynched in the South, and this movement was trying to create basically abolish institutional racism in the United States. And Ali was born in Louisville, as I said, and in 1960 he won the gold medal at the Olympics. This is a young man who is just barely starting out and getting started in his career. He goes and wins the gold medal, and he comes back, and in 1961 he does something dramatic. He changes his name. He says, "I'm no longer Cassius Clay." He says that is my slave name. That is a name that I was forced to have because that name was given to my family by the slave owners. And he then also changes his religion. He becomes a Muslim and changes his name to Muhammad Ali. And says that is another religion that I acquired because of my family being brought to America and made into Christians. So he had and this is an extreme, this is the sort of thing when you say after you become the gold medal winner and you're being adored by your country, by your people, in a way, he just sort of stood up against an incredible reality that was there in front of him, and was a dramatic move. Then, he, right then, just to paint there was another sort of big part. So the civil rights movement coincided with the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War at the time was actually a popular war. It was a war that was being fought to contain the Russians, the Soviet Union, and it was at the time a popular endeavor that the United States had taken on to fight communism. He had just become, in 1964, the world heavyweight champion of the world. He had beaten Sonny Liston, and he was now, he'd become the world heavyweight champion, and he got drafted. So the draft came, and I don't know how many of you know what the draft is. A draft is when in the United States, if the United States is at war, they can take you and ask you to serve in the military as your duty. So he was drafted, and he was asked to join the war effort. And the letter for his drafting came in 1966. And in 1961, he went to Houston, and into the army camp there. He was going to be inducted, and his name was called, and he said, "No, I'm not going to join." So he was arrested and taken to jail. And then from there onwards, he lost his world title. He lost the ability to compete in boxing matches and as a world heavyweight title. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, but he could not fight. He was going to go for 5 years in prison. And remember that at this time, even if he had said, "Yes, I'm going to Vietnam," it wasn't like he was going to go and shoot, guns and get in the line of fire. He was going to, as the world heavyweight champion of the world, he was going to do exhibition matches for the troops and live in relative luxury, right? It was not. He was actually making a stand and saying, "I am not going to go do this." The interesting thing about Ali at the time, even compared to the other civil rights leaders, was the tone and the way he spoke. And that's what amazed me, and he was, always very brash, very loud, very, very outspoken. But the sort of stuff he said really shook things up, right? And this is, I'm going to quote, this is how he stood up and what he said in one of his interviews at a speech at a college campus against the war. "My enemy is the white people, not Viet Cong or Chinese or Japanese. You, my opposer when I want freedom. You are my opposer when I want justice. You are my opposer when I want equality. You won't even stand up for me in America for my religious beliefs. And you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me here at home." And this is what he said. And it required courage at the time. It required him to give up everything he stood for, he had fought for, worked for all his life. And then he went up against the establishment, which was extremely powerful at the time, and just said, "You know what? I'm not going to do this." So again, at that time, he became, from the world heavyweight champion of the world to possibly one of the most hated people in America. And he took it all on as, and stood for what he believed in. I think Ali's actions changed the standard of what constituted an athlete's greatness at the time. Possessing a killer jump or being perfect at hitting a shout was not what was now considered being great. What really mattered was, what were you going to do for the liberation of your people? What were you going to do for your country to live up to the ideals of its founding principles, right? That is a quote from one of the journalists at the time who was following Ali. And the measure of greatness changed because of Ali. Greatness was not to be the baddest, best boxer out there. To be great, you had to do much more than that, right? So he's one of my heroes. He's somebody who spoke against and was fearless, not in the ring, but in real life, right? He was fearless as a person, as a man. He was not perfect, right? He said this himself, right? He bragged, he trash talked, he would insult his opponents. There were many things he didn't do like a model person. I'm trying to portray here. He's not a model person. He's just a very brave, very powerful man who stood up against anything and everything that that the people threw at him. He was, he was given the Sportsman of the Century award by Sports Illustrated, by the BBC. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor, Medal of Freedom, by President Bush. And today his name is associated with awards that are given out to athletes who stand up beyond just the sport. So Colin Kaepernick and others who are who are activists, athletes, who believe in causes and push hard is what he stands for. So he's not perfect, and neither are we, right? So the struggle, as we know, continues in America for equality, for racial equality. We have not become perfect as a country. We know that. We are still looking for making things better. And Muhammad Ali and people like him are the ones we follow. And I, for one, I believe he is a special person, special athlete. Just the person who changed my mind and changed, set my, gave me a new level of what people are expected to do in sport and in life. Right? So really proud of having the chance to present him. I hope you found out about a new dimension of Ali as a person, and hope it gets you going to Wikipedia and read about him. And that's all I have.
Amr, thank you for that presentation. I want to tell you that lots of our viewers who are watching from here in Algeria do know about Muhammad Ali. They were filling the chat with different facts and things that they knew about him. I was really struck in your presentation just by what a big personality he was. And he didn't always say the easy thing. A lot of the things he said made people upset or evoke these emotions in people, but we still remember him as a really great and important person in history, even though he, sometimes made people uncomfortable with the things that he said.
Absolutely. He never took the easy path. He never held back what was in his mind. And at times that resulted in saying things that I believe they were just not maybe, controversial, maybe at times, and he said it later, incorrect, right? And he was kind of like a poet, athlete, activist, and the greatest, one of the great civil rights leaders, frankly. He didn't do it like the non-violent way, I can tell you that.
Not always. Adam, Lyntra, do you guys have any thoughts on Muhammad Ali or anything you wanted to add to Amr's presentation? I don't know if you guys are Muhammad Ali fans or aficionados.
I actually did love Muhammad Ali. One of the stories I loved the most was how he got up after suffering 2 humiliating losses, and he still got up and defeated what was then known as the undefeatable man, George Foreman. That was just breathtaking. His body took a tremendous amount of punishment, and for him to be able to come back after those losses, and no one believed in him, not even his own spouse, his kids, they begged him to retire, and for him to come back and do that was just simply amazing.
Thanks for that. And with that, Lyntra, how about I introduce you and you tell us who you're going to be speaking about. So my pleasure to introduce to you Lyntra Harrington, who is the General Service Officer at the U.S. Embassy Algiers. He was born in North Carolina. He studied finance at the University of Houston. He was in the U.S. Marine Corps for 8 years. Then he went to work in the energy sector. So he's actually a pretty new diplomat. He just joined the U.S. Department of State in 2019. His first tour was Johannesburg, South Africa. So he's here in Algiers. He arrived fairly recently. This is his second posting. So I welcome our viewers to ask Lyntra questions in the chat. You can ask him questions about himself if you'd like, but also questions about who he's presenting on. So Lyntra, who will you be telling us about?
Thank you for the beautiful introduction. I will be talking about a lesser known person, Black male from Black history, who has some great achievements. Unfortunately, he did not realize the fame and success while he was living, but we are starting to find out more about him today. And he's always been a hero of mine since the first time I heard about him when I was about 10 or 11 years old. It's author, essayist, screenwriter by the name of James Baldwin. James is from Harlem, New York. He was born there in 1924, so a little bit right after World War I, and that was during the Roaring 20s. And a little bit of just to give you a little bit of history of what was going on in Harlem, New York at the time, the Great Migration had just almost came to a standstill. So Harlem was pretty much the Mecca for Blackness in America at that time. So he was there with a lot of your great poets, your jazz musicians. So he was greatly influenced by the greatness around him, especially when it came to Black art and art in all different forms and fashions. So James was raised by his mother and his stepfather, whom he who he called his father, because he never knew his biological father. He had 8 siblings. His mother worked hard as a seamstress for much of his life. His stepfather was a Baptist preacher, and that actually influenced a ton of James Baldwin's early life, and that also influenced his writing and his speaking style as well. James did go into the clergy between the ages of roughly 14 to 17, and he actually preached at his stepfather's church, Fireside Pentecostal Assembly, and that's where he really was groomed into his preaching style. And his father was also a part of the civil rights movement, so he would accompany his father to different marches and to different rallies and speeches as well. So he was groomed from a very young age to be very, very outspoken, but humble as well. And this is one of the biggest reasons why James Baldwin has always been a hero of mine, because he's actually a triple minority. He had it hard from every walk of life, because not only was he a Black man, he was also homosexual and an atheist. So even with all of those strikes against him, especially growing up in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, he still was very outspoken. He took control of his narrative, and he refused to be defined by those 3 traits that he was a minority of. And he went on to do great, great things for not only Blacks, but for the entire country as a whole, for religious freedoms and the LGBTQI community as well. Baldwin in the 1940s, that marked several turning points in his life. He graduated high school roughly 1942, 1943. He lost his father, unfortunately, in a race riot in Harlem, and that emotional toll that took on him, becoming the man of the house at 18 years old, and realizing that pretty much all of his hopes and dreams could be lost. It really took a hit. He had to drop college, go home, help his mother raise his 8 younger siblings, and he had to work menial jobs just to help put food on the table. And while doing that, he would play jazz music in nightclubs, and that was his escape. But that also piqued his interest and into his creative and artsy side. 1944, while at a nightclub playing jazz music. He was a jazz guitarist, While playing the jazz guitar, he met a very famous writer and poet named Richard Wright. Richard Wright at the time was the preeminent Black poet. He was, I guess you could say, the Maya Angelou of his time. And he influenced Baldwin tremendously. He helped Baldwin write his first book. He paved the way for Baldwin to move to France, actually, which was Baldwin's home away from home. And he pretty much edited Baldwin's first book. Him and Baldwin, he was not only a friend, he was his mentor and associate and closest confidant. And unfortunately, they did have a big falling out that was very public, but they did mend their fences before each of them passed away. And at the age of 24 is when Baldwin actually did leave to Paris. He could not tolerate the racial and sexual discrimination that he was experiencing daily. He was quoted as saying, if he is not killed, his luck is running out. He will wind up killing someone in defense of himself and his beliefs. So he did flee to Paris to be able to live a freer and more just life. And he actually really found his writing style and his voice while he was there. So around the mid-60s is when Baldwin really got his foothold into the civil rights movement, and a series of debates. And his most famous debate was with and against a gentleman by the name of William F. Buckley. And they had, I believe, debate was at, it was either Harvard or Princeton. And it was about a 2-hour long debate. And most of the moderators soundly agreed with Baldwin's prose, and they voted him the winner of the debate, and that got him a lot of fame and notoriety. But it did not go as planned for Baldwin, because unfortunately there was a string of assassinations with some of the Black leaders, including Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and Martin Luther King. Unfortunately, right around the same time as that debate happened, Malcolm X was assassinated. Then his good friend, a couple of years later, Martin Luther King, was assassinated. So that really limited Baldwin, and it put fear in his heart as well to stay away, unfortunately. Many of his visits to the US, when he would come, he did participate in many family events, and also he attended the March on Selma. He was also at the Capitol of the U.S. to hear Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. So he did participate in much of the struggle. He wrote a ton of books. The Fire Next Time, Notes of a Native Son, and Nobody Knows My Name, just to name a few. And I think those are his top sellers. There are several movies that are made after his books. One is If Beale Street Could Talk. And he left a lasting legacy, and there are still, to this day, movies that have been written off of his works. And unfortunately, he died at a very young age. To me, young age. That's all relative. Of 63 from stomach cancer while he was in Paul da Vinci. In France. So, but his body was buried in New York, and he was buried as a hero, fortunately, because he was finally being accepted right before he passed away. Questions?
Thank you so much for that. A lot of people in our chat do know about James Baldwin also.
Oh, wow.
And especially Majda Jabali is just dropping lots of James Baldwin facts in the chats, and she's pointing out that he had a close relationship with Maya Angelou, and apparently he helped Maya Angelou publish her first book. Lyntra, can I ask you, why did you choose James Baldwin as a person to present on? Are you a writer yourself? If not, how did you learn about James Baldwin?
Oh, wow, great question. I loved his charisma. I loved that he looked danger in the face when he had so many obstacles against him, and he still stood his ground. He was very graceful and very knowledgeable, even though he wasn't able to go to college when he wanted to, and he had just so many things against him that he overcame. He looked death in the eye, and he overcame, and he did not back down. And I just love his courage. Just so much against him, and he stood on his own too. I love it. And no, I am not a writer except for EER season.
EER, for our people watching, is our State Department acronym for every year we have to write these very complicated reviews about our performance as a diplomat. And they're kind of reviled in the State Department because they're very hard to write. So maybe if we all had James Baldwin's writing skills, it would be an easier task.
True.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lyntra. So everybody, please stick around. We're going to have a couple more presentations, and then we're just going to have maybe a more general conversation afterwards. We have some questions coming in on YouTube that we'll get to in a little bit. So please continue to ask your questions in the YouTube chat. But I would love to introduce you to our next speaker, who is Adam Sigelman, who is the cultural attaché at the U.S.Embassy Algiers. I should also admit to you that he's my husband. So Adam and I have worked at various U.S. embassies around the world, including in Yemen, Madrid, Jerusalem, and Rabat. We've both been in Algiers for 2.5 years, and we really love it here. Adam, who are you going to be telling our audience about today?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Emily. I will be talking today about Colin Powell.
Colin Powell. Okay, do our YouTube viewers know who Colin Powell is?
I bet you a few people know of him. He's quite well known internationally, and of course in the United States. And I particularly decided to pick him because he was never my boss. I joined the State Department about a decade after he was Secretary of State, but he was the top diplomat, and I figured I would pick somebody from my profession, not just somebody from my profession, but somebody I think really did diplomacy well, and not just did diplomacy well, but really is somebody I admire as a leader and a manager. And what I think he brought to the U.S. diplomatic corps, the State Department, in terms of leadership and management, is something I think we still benefit from as diplomats today. So, with that, let me just hop into a quick presentation here. I really do want to get to the Q&A, so I'm going to go relatively quick here, and then allow folks to ask questions if they want. The other reason I decided to pick Colin Powell is because, unfortunately, he passed away last year, and so he was kind of on our minds recently as we all look back on his career as a general and as well as a statesman. So, very quick biography about Colin Powell. He's born in New York City in 1937, so between the wars. To two parents who had immigrated from Jamaica. So he was a what we call a first generation American. That's to say that he was the first of his generation to be born in the United States. He joined the Army right after graduating college in 1958, and then throughout his illustrious career in the Army, he ended up rising to the rank of a 4-star general. He's had a number of political appointments. He was a Republican, so he mostly worked, but not always worked, for Republican presidents. He started off working for President Reagan in the 1980s as a deputy national security advisor. He also was the national security advisor under Reagan after that, and then served as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is one of the top military advisors in the White House under George Bush, and then continued in that role briefly, at least, under President Clinton. And then he was Secretary of State, so that's to say our top diplomat, the big boss for us under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2005. But what I really admire about Colin Powell is, like I said before, what he brought in terms of leadership and management. And still in the State Department, I mean, he was the head of the State Department almost 2 decades ago at this point. But his 13 rules for leadership is a document. It's an email now, and actually, it's important that I mention email. Just a quick aside. The State Department is very slow, like governments and bureaucracies are, to adopt technology. And when he was Secretary of State, he came in and was shocked that email wasn't more widely used in the State Department in the 21st century. So one of the many things that he did as Secretary of State has revolutionized the technology that we use in the State Department. So thankfully now we all are sending emails like the rest of the world. But his 13 rules of leadership are often sent around among diplomats. I've even seen them in certain diplomats' offices as posters on the wall. So I just want to I'm going to go through these because I think they're just important rules for not just leaders of a diplomatic corps, but really anybody working in any position. So he said he used a very colloquial language, which I also appreciate. So he said it ain't as bad as you think. It'll look better in the morning. I think is important advice for really anybody, not just people who are working as employees. Get mad, then get over it. He was known as a leader to be somebody who was very much in control of his self. So of course, like anybody else, he would get angry, but he would try to take a calm approach to solving issues. I try to do and succeed, I would say, well, most of the time, not all the time. This is my favorite one. Avoid having your ego so close to your position that when your position falls, your ego goes with it. Now, it's a little complicated, but basically what he's saying here is that it's important to not have an opinion that's so strong that you care more about winning the argument than you do about what you're trying to achieve jointly with the person with whom you're arguing. And this is something I feel like we all suffer from. I do particularly. So I really try to remember this one. Fourth one, he was always positive. It can be done. Always good to be positive. Also, at the same time, be careful what you choose. You may get it. Don't let adverse facts stand in the way of a good decision. Another way of saying this, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You can't make someone else make decisions, and you shouldn't let somebody else make your own decisions. This is kind of about humility, about what we can change in our in our work environment. Check the small things, share credit, which is really important. Remain calm, again, being in control of oneself. Be kind. Have a vision. So be looking at the big picture, but also be demanding. And don't take counsel of your fears or your naysayers. So all these things that he brought to the department, not just through his 13 rules, but through leadership training and management training, I think is just really important. We had a before Colin Powell, and even to this day, to an extent, we had a culture in the State Department where we didn't necessarily think a lot about management. We didn't necessarily think a lot about leadership. We kind of had a culture where, at least a stereotype of diplomatic managers were people who didn't care too much about their employees, or they'd yell at their employees, and everyone's kind of stressed and frazzled and not really thinking about the big picture and how to get things done. And when Colin Powell came in, and you hear this from ambassadors, you hear this from people who work directly for him, he really changed that culture. And so that's something I feel like as a diplomat, I benefit from now, and I really thank him for. So with that, I will end, and really looking forward to the debate and the conversation.
Thank you, Adam. So you just shared with us why you appreciate Colin Powell for kind of how he influenced the culture of the State Department, which is the organization for which we work. There are a lot of questions in the chat who are asking about Colin Powell's involvement with the Iraq War. Abu Adam and Azaru Amar are, curious, how does this influence his legacy? How does this influence how you think about Colin Powell? And I know that Colin Powell himself has spoken a bit on his involvement in the Iraq War, so maybe you could share some of that with us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a valid question. And, if you read his obituaries that came out when he passed away last year, his involvement in the Iraq War was, if not in the first paragraph, it was in the second or third paragraph. This is in my opinion, and I think he's even said this since then, it's a blemish on his record as a politician, as a statesman. He got it wrong. I think we all admit at this point that the intelligence that was presented at that time was incorrect, and it led us, the United States, to perhaps make a decision that it would not have made otherwise. But you know what? I think that the way he has dealt with this and dealt with something that was, like I said, it was really, I think, difficult for him and all those people involved to own up to the fact that they made a huge mistake. And not all of them did. There's still people to this day who try to defend it or try to make excuses. But I think that he didn't do that, and that he was somebody who admitted that and regretted it. And I actually respect that, because we all make mistakes. We all make often big mistakes, especially when you're in very important positions like Secretary of State. Every Secretary of State, every president has made very, very, very big mistakes, and have affected a lot of people. And I just think that's inevitable in our lives. And rather than try to make excuses or try to shove it under the rug, I appreciated the way that I think he dealt with it later in his life.
Okay, great. Well, I am curious, Amar or Lyntra, if you guys want to add anything on that. You are diplomats too. You might want to say something on this. We are getting a little short on time. So if either of you wanted to quickly add anything, feel free.
No, I think he's an impressive personality, and I agree that he really changed the culture at the department. And so many of our senior officers that I've talked to attribute incredible things that have happened in the department because of him. He he also grew up during the, he was in the military in Vietnam, probably when Muhammad Ali was talking about not going there and putting his life at risk. I think as somebody who's going to lead the State Department has to be ready to make mistakes, and yes, and be able to look back at himself and say, yeah, well, there are things that we do get wrong, and the United States gets things wrong. And it was not just him who got that wrong; it was a lot of people around him. So, and he's, at least as Adam said, strong enough to say, well, yeah, we got it wrong.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I would just skip my presentation, but I can't because we haven't spoken about any women yet. And I want to speak about this very impressive woman. So I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly and reveal to you the person I want to tell you about is Ida B. Wells. She was a journalist, an activist, and a suffragette, which means someone who fought for women's right to vote. I chose her because I was a journalist for a number of years, so I really respect what she was doing. She was a journalist when it was extremely difficult to be a Black journalist in the US and very difficult to be a female journalist. So Ida B. Wells is from much earlier than everyone else that we've heard about today. She was actually born when slavery was still a thing in the United States. She was born into slavery in 1862. A few years later, slavery was abolished in the United States by something called the Emancipation Proclamation. So when she was about 3 years old, she was no longer a slave. Her family really valued education. And she actually went to university at a time when it was extremely rare for a Black person to go to university. She was actually forced to drop out, though, because sadly her parents and a sibling got yellow fever and died when she was fairly young. So she had to take care of her siblings, and she started working as a teacher. So she first became very interested in social justice because she was on a train in the year 1884. She paid for a first-class ticket, but the conductor told her that she had to move off of the first class train and go on to a special train for African Americans. Because even after slavery was outlawed in the United States, it was still a super segregated society. There were things for African Americans and there were things for white people. So she actually sued this train company, and it looked like she was going to win, but then unfortunately the Supreme Court overturned the decision. So she actually ended up losing that case, which was something that was very upsetting to her. She began writing about race and politics in the American South. Our Algerian audience might not know, but the American South refers to the southern states in the United States, and racism at this time was much worse in the American South. So she started talking about race at a time that people were not really talking about it. She founded a newspaper. She also continued to work at a school. And I noted that it was a segregated school there because at that time there were schools for white kids, there were schools for Black kids. She started writing about something extremely controversial in the United States, and that's the practice of lynching. So lynching is basically when a mob of people kill a person, and at this time, it was almost always that they were killing Black people. There's no trial, there's no trial, it's just that people killed a person for a crime they said that they committed. This was a big problem, especially in the American South. So she started writing about this, and it was not a very popular thing. Many white people did not really want her to be writing about this. So actually, after one article she wrote, her newspaper was burned to the ground, basically. She moved north to Chicago. She continued writing about lynching, about anti-segregation, about civil rights, and about women's rights. So at this time, women could not vote. They couldn't vote until 1920. She founded the National Association of Colored Women, and she helped found the National Association for the Advancements of Colored People, or the NAACP, as we call it, which still exists today. And like I said, she was really active in helping women get the right to vote. We might talk about this next month when it's Women's History Month, but Black women were very much kind of left out of that movement and discriminated against that movement. But she still was a part of it. She thought it was very important for women to have the right to vote. And she actually was awarded a Pulitzer Prize, which is our biggest prize in journalism, like 100 years after she died. Because the Pulitzer Prize committee just recommended like how courageous this was for this woman to be writing about something so controversial during this time. So I know I kind of rushed through that, but I really wanted to share with you the legacy of Ida B. Wells, a complete trailblazer in the field of journalism, a complete trailblazer in the field of anti-segregation, and a complete trailblazer in the field of getting women the right to vote. A big inspiration for me. Okay, guys. I'm not going to ask if you have any comments on that. I'm just going to move on to a couple questions that we have in the YouTube chat that are kind of more general questions that are mostly around the theme, why are we talking about race right now? Why are we referring to Black Americans or African Americans? Aren't we all just Americans? There's a couple questions like Abu Adam asks, why do we talk and divide by skin color? So I'm curious if any of you want to chime in on why are we even having this talk? Why do we do this as Americans?
I think that's an interesting question. I think the way the French people look at race and the way they think about race is that there is no color, right? You sort of want to ignore it and sort of just say everybody's the same. And in America, there is this thing, which is the African American or Pakistani American or Jewish American, and there are many other sort of segments of us. And the answer is complicated, I'm sure, but I think the reality is that ignoring the differences is and not acknowledging them, and we is sort of fallacy, right? I became American, but I don't stop being from Pakistan. I was born there, and so the reality is, yes, I'm a Pakistani American, I'm a Muslim American, I'm many things, right? So there are all these differences, and celebrating them, I think, allows us to understand each other better, and then acknowledging them. And reality is that we should acknowledge them and the challenges that each segment faces. And the fact is, there are challenges that each segment faces these challenges. I mean, it's reality. Not acknowledging and not really thinking about it and not focusing on it once in a while is just leads to ignorance, leads to people not knowing about each other. Right? That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in on that too. It's a good question and it's a good debate. And Amar's right that other countries take different approaches to it. But the American approach is to celebrate our unity while and through, I would say, celebrating our differences. I think that has a lot to do with the history of our country as a country that was founded by people who came from all over the world. I think that also has to do, especially when you look at Black History Month, Women's History Month, and other months, Native American Month. You're also looking at righting wrongs of the past, or at least trying to right wrongs of the past, in the sense that if you look at the founding of our country, at least the people who were in the room signing the original documents, those were all white men. Those were all white European men. And that was because for many years, we did not allow other people to participate. And that is wrong. And that's something that it's the stain on our history. It's the original sin of the United States. And it's something that is not just in our history, but continues to the present day. We've obviously made a ton of progress, but I think that racism and discrimination exist in the United States as they do exist everywhere in the world. And I agree 100% with Amar. If you ignore it, if you watch it, if you pretend like differences don't exist and just focus on the fact that we're all Americans, then you're not doing anything to try to make the situation better. So I really do believe that shining a spotlight on people who have overcome the odds against discrimination, against racism, and succeeded, acknowledging as well that there would be dozens, hundreds, thousands more of them, to highlight if we didn't have racism and discrimination. I think that's critically important, not just because they deserve it, but also as a tool for us to try to continue to deal with those issues and make life more equitable for everybody moving forward.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your thoughtful comments, for sharing your presentations. I hope our viewers watching perhaps learned something new, maybe learned about somebody who they hadn't heard of before. So again, even if you're not a history buff, maybe you just found this interesting because you learned something new. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss talks like this one. We do these most Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Next week, we're going to have my colleague Megan on, who's going to be hosting an episode of a show we call To Speak You. It's our show on learning English. And she's going to look at important speeches by African Americans and how you can use those speeches as a tool to improve your English. So if maybe the English in this episode was a bit fast for you, that episode might be a bit easier if you're kind of just learning English. So thanks so much for tuning in to our guest, Amr, Lyntra, Adam. You guys were great. Thanks so much. And have a great night, everyone.